This video is brought to you by the Kickstarter for Alkander's Almanac of All Things. Alkander's Almanac of All Things is a modular 5th edition rule expansion created by friend of this channel, the Dungeon Coach. Dungeon Coach's expertise is in the creation of homebrew, so you know this is being done by someone who knows what they're doing. The Almanac is going to expand on all the pillars of D&D, including new tactical options in combat, including new martial actions. We're actually going to get more options for extra attack beyond just attacking twice. Also, we're going to see new conditions, new spell mechanics, and many more ways to customize combat at your table. Exploration in your game is going to have new ways to run travel, random encounters, downtime, and a brand new system for resting. Systems and options to weave into social interactions and ways to inspire your players to get into the role-playing experience. This should bring depth and life to your gaming table. Alkander's Almanac of All Things focuses on giving you options that you can pick and choose from to fit the style of game that you and your players are going to find the most rewarding. So check out the link to the Kickstarter at the top of the video description and check out this fantastic project. Hey Optimancers, Chris here. In this series I've been discussing the ranks of every subclass in the game. Artificers and Barbarians have all been ranked on the chart, and today we're moving on to the Bard subclasses. If you would like to support the content on this channel, please check the link in the video description for my Patreon. Patrons of this channel see these videos early and non-monetized, and my top-level patrons can join me to play some D&D every month. Today I'd like to recognize these top-level patrons: Adversity, Airhead, Alex Kiv, Rob Reichelt, Anna, Aurelio Christian, Awesome Face, Ben Potts, Benjamin, and Black. Thank you all so much for your support. Let's get started. So here's where I go over how the ranking system works. If you've watched the previous videos, you may want to click on the next chapter in the timeline. So here is how it will work. I will not be discussing any subclass that is not official content. So subclasses that are third-party or playtest material are not included. This is a power ranking, so I'm not taking into account how well they are designed in this ranking or my personal preference. This will take into account how powerful they are as a single class build, as well as how powerful they are when multi-classed. I will be assuming feats are allowed and used, and that all the optional class features in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything are allowed as well. Just some things to note as well. Features are weighted by how soon they are received. A feature you get at level 3 is much more valuable than a feature you get at level 10, because these features see way more gameplay when you actually play the subclass. So this is not a comparison of which of these subclasses are more powerful at 20th level. I don't think that's very relevant to players. This is a comparison as to which you will find most powerful, assuming you are starting at low level and advancing levels through gameplay. A feature you have for 100% of that time is 5 times more valuable than a feature you're going to have for 20%. And although I will consider all 3 pillars of gameplay, I will be weighing the combat tier most heavily. The combat tier tends to be the tier that is most reliant on mechanics, and mechanics is what I'm looking at here. I also assume you will not be playing as a solo character. So features that work well with teammates, or even better, improve your teammates, will be considered in the ranking. Now before we begin, I'm going to address a couple common misconceptions before they come up. A bad feature does not make a subclass less powerful. I can add 10 terrible and practically useless features to the most powerful subclasses, and they're still the most powerful. I'm only looking at features that make a subclass better. Secondly, just because a feature can be replicated with a feat does not mean the feature isn't good. Feats are not free, and they can be very powerful. They can even be more powerful than a subclass feature. So a feature that can be replicated by a good feat can still be a great feature, improving the power level of the subclass. And the person playing that subclass has 1 extra feat they can use on any of the many potent feats in the game. I guarantee you're not going to have enough feats, and having 1 more is a big benefit. These rankings, of course, are subjective, and I don't expect anyone to agree with them in their entirety. And I do have some personal biases, which will probably become apparent. I like spells. I think they can be very powerful. And that's going to be clear enough as we move forward. Also, I should say, I like to make my saving throws, and I don't care who knows it. Give me a way to do that more reliably, and I'm likely to consider a subclass more powerful because of it. Finally, I don't assume you will be limited to one encounter per day. I don't assume you will have short rests whenever you want. So features that can be used more often, I consider to be more powerful than single-use ones. Now, this is a very common rating system in D&D for the ranking of classes and subclasses, and it includes anywhere from the S tier being the highest and the D tier being the lowest, and I will not be using it. Instead, I'll be using this expanded tier chart that includes an E and F tier. Here are the criteria I will be ranking the subclasses with. If I give a subclass an S tier ranking, I don't just think it's powerful. I think it's probably too powerful. I think there are some potentially game-breaking mechanics involved, and these are going to come into play without requiring high-level play at all. My issue with these subclasses is you have a real possibility of invalidating other player character features. This can lead to overshadowing other players, and so if you're a power gamer, these options are for you. If you aren't, I think I would think carefully before selecting an S tier subclass. If I give a subclass an A tier ranking, I think it's a very powerful option. Characters using an A tier subclass are easy to optimize and have features that should be showstoppers in gameplay, stomping down challenges with abandon. We may not break the game, but we're definitely going to make it a fair bit easier. If I give a subclass a B tier ranking, I think it's a good subclass. Optimizing a B tier subclass should result in a very effective character that has a strong contribution to a party of characters. Even with limited optimization, a B tier subclass is probably still going to be reasonably effective. If I give a subclass a C tier ranking, I think it's a decent option. Optimizing a C tier subclass may require a bit more thought about how to make the best use of the features, but they can still be quite effective if handled with some thought and consideration. If I give a subclass a D tier ranking, I think it's serviceable. Optimizing a D tier rank subclass will lead to a decent character that can usually still pull their weight, but I wouldn't expect to stand out. If I give a subclass an E tier ranking, I think it's a weaker option. An E tier subclass needs some extra effort to make a character that contributes effectively at all, or perhaps the contributions they make end up being extremely narrow, or rely heavily on other characters helping them out. It's still possible to make a character that can be somewhat effective with an E tier subclass, but if you just play it as it's presented, you can probably expect a disappointing experience. If I give a subclass an F tier ranking, I think it's basically unredeemable. An F tier ranked subclass differentiates from an E tier subclass because it is bound to disappoint, and there just aren't any good ways to optimize it to make it worthwhile. And the F tier subclasses, along with the S tier subclasses, I think can be a problem when considering a team of players because they create pretty overwhelming imbalance. Subclasses aren't balanced against each other, and that's normally okay. But when you have these extreme cases on either end, it can weaken the game. When subclasses receive the same rank, I will be placing subclasses I think are more potent, more to the left of the chart, with the weaker further to the right. So at the end of this series, I will have a comprehensive list from top to bottom of every class and subclass combination in the game, all 114 of them. So let's look at what the Bard chassis gives us. First, we have D8 hit points, so middle of the road, light armor proficiency and no shield proficiency. Put those together and there's not a lot going on defensively for the Bard class. We get some martial weapon proficiencies, though considering a weaker defense, running up to melee with a rapier is probably not a good idea. We get 3 skill proficiencies, which is above average, and you can customize since you can choose any skill. The iconic Bard ability is the Bardic Inspiration, and this is a good ability. You can hand out D6s to allies they can use on an ability check, an attack roll, or a saving throw, With Tashes, it can also be used to boost a healing or damaging spell, though that probably wouldn't be my first choice with it. 10-minute duration is not bad on this, though you can hand them out with a bonus action, so giving them out in combat is perfectly reasonable. And these don't need to be used until after the initial die roll is made, so you use it when you need it. The die type scales to D12 eventually, and you go from long rest recovery of dice to short rest recovery at level 5. So that's happening not too late in the campaign. We get some other really good abilities too. Jack of all trades at level 2 is a bonus for any ability check that we're not adding proficiency already. And that means everything from initiative to dispel magic to any tool or any skill we're not proficient, all of those things get a boost. At 3rd level, we're getting expertise in a couple skills as well. Combined with Jack of all trades, this has bards competing for the best skill using class in the game. The big draw for bards though, of course, is that they're a full casting class. Bards use the spells known mechanic, but they start out 2 spells ahead of sorcerers and warlocks. That's twice as many, and that gap just gets bigger as levels go up. So bards don't suffer the same limitation in spell versatility as either of those classes do. They're also ritual casters, so they can get some spells that won't be using spell slots. So in a couple ways they really do quite well with spell casting. Now the spell list for bards isn't bad, but I wouldn't say it's one of the better spell lists. They have some great spells on the list, but there's also a number of gaps. They don't have summoning options, and battlefield controls like walls, webs, and the like just aren't represented heavily. They eventually do get some teleports, but Misty Step is noticeably absent, so they have no lower level options. Spells that deal damage aren't a bard's specialty either. They have a few options, and animate objects can actually do a lot of damage, but there are fewer options than other classes get. Bards are also noticeably missing attack cantrips. Vicious Mockery is an okay option against low CR creatures, but it really becomes lackluster as monsters start getting multiple attacks. Tashes really did pad the bard spell list nicely, but they still have some limited defensive options, but they're strong on debuffing, enchanting, and healing, and there's some good utility. So it's middle of the road really. And although bards can eventually access a few spells out of their class list, this doesn't come until the double-digit levels. The draw of going high-level bard is all about the spells. The other improvements are pretty minor, but because Magical Secrets comes in at 10th, 14th, and 18th, it gives us 3 windows to access the best spells in the game, meaning eventually bards become one of the best primary spellcasters in the game. But that doesn't happen until higher levels. So, bards, they're a pretty good chassis. Primary spellcasting, not the best in the game, but not the worst. Pretty good class ability with inspiration. But we also have some challenges with bards, like some gaps in spell types and some defensive struggles. So let's take a look at our subclasses and see how they work with that. Our first subclass is the College of Creation. This one was introduced in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. Every bard subclass either improves inspiration or gives us another use for it. In this case, we have an improvement to base inspiration, which is fairly good. Each use for boosting an ability check, attack roll, or saving throw get unique advantages, and none of them are bad, though none are amazing either. There's no boost to the magical inspiration Tasha's option. Performance of Creation allows a creation bard to create non-magical items. This could be broken, or it could be pure utility based on how your DM works with it. I suspect at most tables, it's going to be basically utility. And that's it for 3rd level, which is the biggest drawback of the Creation Bard. It doesn't come in as strong as some of the other subclasses. At level 6, we get Animating Performance, which gives us our pet option. This one is really neat because you animate an object to become your pet, and it could be potentially broken because it doesn't specify the object needs to be unattended. Once again, I expect some DM limitations at most tables will keep this in check, in which case it's a perfectly reasonable pet option, though it's gained a bit later than other subclasses with pets because they usually end up providing them at 3rd level. We're waiting until 6th level. Also, this pet has a 1-hour duration, and you need to spend at least a 3rd level spell slot to do it again. So creation is potentially a broken subclass if there are no limits placed on a couple abilities. But in both cases, I think I would expect they'll be perfectly functionable and reasonable abilities at most tables. The level 6 feature is really quite good, but we get less at third than I would like to see in a subclass. I think you'll find your creation bard, though, to be a good character. Pretty strong spellcasting, good utility, but you'll want to think a bit about feat selections or maybe a multi-class dip to boost those weaker defenses. And all that together, I think, puts it in a B ranking. I think it is a good subclass. Our next subclass is the College of Eloquence. This was introduced in Mythic Odyssey of Theros and reprinted in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. At third level, we get Silver Tongue, which treats any d20 roll on persuasion or deception checks of lower than 10 as 10. Considering this class is charisma based, and we can choose those skills for proficiencies, and even expertise if we want to be obscene, we can end up at level 5 with a minimum result of 20 on either of these skills, so I would expect to never fail either of them, ever. We also get an alternate use for inspiration called Unsettling Words, and this is the one everybody talks about. Use an inspiration die as a bonus action to reduce a creature's next saving throw by that amount. So you can bonus action this, then follow it up with a spell with your action. You can set up teammates too, but considering that bards are primary spellcasters with a spell list that's more centered on spells that provide saving throws and nothing happens on a success, more than other spellcasters, setting up your own spell is a really good use. Now, this isn't free. We are using inspiration dice, which means we're not handing them out for buffing. But this is still really, really good because it takes the most powerful thing we can do and then makes it better. We don't slow down at level 6 either, because when we do hand out bardic dice to our allies, they only lose the die if it turns a failed check into a success with our unfailing inspiration feature. So basically, they might as well try, even if the odds aren't good, because it can't waste the inspiration. This is also really good, and it's going to have you splitting your inspiration between allies and Unsettling Words and getting great value either way. We also get a decent feature at level 6, and 14 is another good feature. So everything is good here. We get a lot at level 3, more at 6, and although nothing necessarily breaks your game, optimizing an Eloquence Bard gets fantastic results. You still have that defense challenge to think about, but you're going to end up with a very potent character. That makes Eloquence Bards our first A-ranked subclass. Next is the College of Glamour. This one is from Xanathar's Guide to Everything. At third level, we get an alternate use of our inspiration that provides some temporary hit points to a group of allies, including yourself if you like, and any of them can make a reaction movement that doesn't provoke. The temporary hit points start at 5, but they scale up reasonably well with your level. This is a perfectly reasonable feature. It used to be one of the best ways to provide temporary hit points mid-battle, but you know what? It's still solid, but it's just not as unique as it used to be. Also, at third level, we get Enthralling Performance, which can charm a bunch of creatures. This one is utility, not a combat feature, because it takes a minute, but it really does make the Glamour Bard well suited as the bard that can most enthrall an audience and gain their admiration. Also notable that creatures that make their saving throw have no idea you tried to charm them. Our level 6 feature is pretty solid. With Mantle of Majesty, you can cast command as a bonus action and do so again every round for the next minute, which is really quite good. Though it is important to mention that if you're casting a spell as a bonus action, you can't cast a leveled spell with your action. Now, if you do manage to charm a creature with like a charm person or something, then it automatically fails the command saving throw. There's some multi-class combinations that might work well with this, but on its own, I would say it's still quite good. Our higher level feature isn't bad, but what we basically have is a decent use of our inspiration and some utility at 3, then the bonus action command at 6, which is quite good, meaning the Glamour Bard, I'd say, is a pretty good subclass. It's strange, I don't see the Glamour Bard used often in optimized builds, and I would say it's probably underutilized and underrated, as I think it's a solid B, and I'm putting it even ahead of Creation, I think it's just as good as some subclasses we talk a lot more about. Next is the College of Lore, which I think has had more discussion in the optimization circles than any other Bard subclass since its release right in the player's handbook. I think until fairly recently, and Eloquence was released, there was this assumption that if you played a Bard, you should play a Lore Bard. At level 3 we get 3 additional skill proficiencies, which is good. I'm always up for more skill proficiencies. Though I will say, when it comes to Bards, we already have Jack of all trades. So we're already halfway there. So this may not be as valuable as skill proficiencies on a non-Bard. Then we get Cutting Words, which is an alternate use of our inspiration die. Cutting Words, unlike most inspiration, uses a reaction to provide the die roll as a penalty to an attack roll, ability check, or damage roll. Like with regular inspiration, this can be done after the die roll is made. I think the use I hear about most is trying to turn attacks against your Bard into misses. I have never found this wonderfully valuable personally, since it's based on a die roll, and so it doesn't end up being terribly reliable. And it only affects a single attack, and it uses a valuable resource. Generally, I find Cutting Words to be an okay alternate use of inspiration, but I'm not sure it's just better than handing out inspiration dice, and in many cases I'd say it's not as good. That said, it is decent, but I do often find it overrated by players I talk to. At 6th level though, we get a banger. Additional Magical Secrets gives us 2 additional spells known out of any spell list. This is as good as any Bard 6th level feature and better than most. We can start to fill in those spell gaps much earlier in play. I won't list all the great options, there's just too many, but a good summon spell and a good defensive spell are probably good choices. Now, keep in mind, we're not talking extra spell slots, so these spells aren't free to cast like they are with the Glamour Bard. At 14th level, we get an okay ability. So, do I think Lore Bards are good? Absolutely. Do I think they aren't as good as a lot of players assume? Absolutely. Cutting Words is fine, but it's not great. And honestly, at level 3, we don't get anything really fantastic. Our level 6 ability is really good, and that's the thing that makes this subclass a good subclass. But it's not a mix of a bunch of great features throughout the levels or anything like that. Defense is still a challenge here, so we will need to think carefully about feats and perhaps multiclassing. So Lore scores a solid B in my book, and I would put it ahead of Glamour and Creation. Next, we come to our newest Bard subclass, the College of Spirits, which we find in Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. At level 3, we get a free cantrip, which happens to be one of the best cantrips, Guidance, and we can cast it up to 60 feet away, and Bards normally can't access that cantrip. We also get Tales from Beyond, which is basically the iconic feature of the subclass. This is our alternate use of inspiration, and it has us roll on a random table for a buff, damage, or debuff effect we can place using our action. This is normally the kind of feature I hate, but I will say that the options here are pretty good, and they're likely to be useful, and because you can keep hold of it until the right time for it to work well comes up, this is actually not that bad as it turns out. At 6th level we get Spirit Session, which allows us to do an hour-long ritual that allows our character to learn an additional spell of the Divination or Necromancy school from any class. Summon Undead comes to my mind right away. We can change the spell after a long rest if we do the ritual again. So this isn't all that great, but again, it's not terrible. I mean, it's an extra spell known that we can change out regularly, and it can fill a niche we normally couldn't. Then we get an okay ability at level 14, and we have a Bard subclass that performs adequately. I don't think there's anything here that really stands out as especially potent. I do think this subclass got underrated when it first came out. I heard a lot of talk that it sucked. I don't think it sucks, but I do think it's not one of the better Bards. But it is good enough to make a perfectly effective character, and I think that does land it as a solid C. Next up, College of Swords. This one is from Xanathar's Guide to Everything, and I see this one used in builds quite a bit, and I've used it myself quite a few times. At 3rd level, we get a fighting style of either dueling or 2-weapon fighting. Neither of these would have been my first choices, but +2 damage with a rapier poke, it's fine. Then we get our Blade Flourish, which is our alternate use of inspiration. When we take the attack action and use a Bardic Inspiration die, we get our Blade Flourish, which doesn't take a bonus action. It's just part of the attack action, so that is nice. We get a speed boost for the turn, and we add the inspiration die to our damage, and then we can get one of 3 additional benefits, which can be damage to another target, a push of the target of the attack and some more movement, or my favorite, the defensive flourish, which boosts our armor class. So this is a really solid defensive boost. The armor class bonus lasts until our next turn, so against every attack, which is way better than everything else that Flourish gives us as far as I'm concerned. In pushing and pulling parties, which I'm seeing more of these days, I could see mobile Flourish being of more use as well. So this is a great ability because it helps us shore up one of our biggest weaknesses. Now it's not free. This means that we're not using our inspiration to buff our allies, and I wouldn't expect to see a lot of inspiration dice handed out from the average Swords Bard, and that is definitely a downside. Finally, at 3rd level, you get proficiency in medium armor, the scimitar, and you can use your weapon as a spellcasting focus. So, medium armor, that's good. It's likely going to boost your armor class, but there's no shield proficiency, and that means we still aren't going to have an amazing armor class. Probably 16 or 17. Still, I'll take that over a 14 or 15. At level 6, we get extra attack, and although Swords Bards have more weapon options than other Bards do, don't expect their damage to keep up with martial classes. And the Bard spell list is really not built around a Gish build. In fact, it's probably the worst spell list in the game for that purpose. However, a Swords Bard will be good enough with a weapon that it can make up for not having attack cantrip options, and we're probably better off defensively than most other Bards, but you probably won't be durable enough to duke it out in melee all the time, but you can certainly dabble. At 14th level, we actually get a great boost to our Flourish, but it comes really late. Now, straight class Swords Bard is fine. You're going to have full spellcasting, a bit better defense than a standard Bard, and a passable thing to do when you aren't casting spells or concentrating on spells. But where Swords Bards do particularly well is mixed in multiclassing. Defensive Flourish takes a Bard and makes their defense okay, but it can take a Paladin and make their defense amazing. Flourish pairs well with real weapon specialists, or if you want to be primarily a Bard, getting that shield proficiency is still something you should consider, one way or another. So Swords Bard is solid overall. Level 3 is quite good, though level 6 is less stellar. If you do want to swing a weapon, Swords is your best option for Bard, though the so-called best weapon user for Bard, that's not a high bar. B for me, this is a good subclass on a good class. I'm putting it in last place in B compared to the other Bards, but it is definitely solid. Next up is the Valor Bard. This was the other subclass option from the Player's Handbook, and I always found it underrated, though I think a lot of people have come around on Valor. At level 3, we come in with 1 decent and 1 strong ability. First, we get proficiency in martial weapons, shields, and medium armor. And until the Eloquence Bard came out, as far as I'm concerned, this was the best 3rd level feature available for Bards. Now, can any Bard get medium armor and shield proficiency with a feat? Yes. But think about it. Is Cutting Words better than Warcaster? Is it better than Fey Touched? Because that's the choice you're making. Don't get me wrong, Moderately Armored is a good feat investment for a Bard, but Valor ends up a feat ahead for just that reason, which makes this an excellent feature. Then we get our inspiration use, which gives the allies who get inspiration from us some additional options. So an ally can use our inspiration on the standard ability check, saving throw, attack roll, or spell boost, but it can also use it for weapon damage or as a reaction to increase their armor class, very much like Cutting Words, but for your allies. So it's okay. Like with Cutting Words, it's for 1 attack, which is a big limitation, but having more options for the inspiration die is definitely a good thing. At level 6, we get extra attack, and like with Swords Bard, this can somewhat make up for not having an attack cantrip, but the Valor Bard gets less from this because they have no flourish or fighting style, but at least with a shield and medium armor, we aren't made of paper, so closing to melee isn't suicide. Our level 14 ability is fine, not great. So the draw of the Valor Bard is primarily the armor and shield, which frankly is a big draw, and you get it right away. With a dex of 14, that's going to move you from like an armor class of 14 or 15 to an armor class of 18 or 19. So like +4 to your armor class. Being that it eliminates one of the biggest weaknesses of the class right away, I think that, along with some other okay features, makes Valor a particularly strong B. Honestly, Lore and Valor are probably tied in my books, and they both sneak a sliver ahead of Glamour. So I'm putting Valor right ahead of Lore, but it could be the other way. Like I said, basically, Valor and Lore, as far as I'm concerned, that's a tie. Our last Bard subclass is the College of Whispers. This one came out in Xanathar's Guide to Everything. Level 3, we get our alternate use of Bardic Inspiration, which is a boost to one of your weapon damage rolls. The damage is 2d6, and it scales with your level. This definitely boosts your damage more than just getting a Bardic die, like the Swords Bard Flourish gives, but unlike Blade Flourish, it's just the damage, and Whispers don't get martial weapons or extra attack, so this ends up being like Sneak Attack, except it uses up a resource, and it scales more slowly. So I really don't like this one. I've played Whispers, and I use Psychic Blades on occasion, just to get some single target damage. But as far as alternate uses for inspiration goes, this one is the least impressive of the lot, in my opinion. It's not useless, but it's just not great. And most of the time, I think you're better off just giving it out as inspiration. Then we get Words of Terror, which is a utility ability. And it's not terrible, but we can compare this to the 3rd level Glamour ability, which charms multiple targets. And this one is only a single target, otherwise they're very similar abilities. So this one seems just worse overall. At level 6, we get Mantle of Whispers, which is also pure utility. But I think this is a pretty potent utility, but it is definitely circumstantial. And an okay ability at 14. And Whispers just seems to bring less to the table than any of the other Bard subclasses. But, you know what? You're still a full caster, a great skill user, you've got inspiration, and some features that you're going to get some use out of. So you can still make a perfectly viable character with Whispers. And I think in a campaign heavy in intrigue, you might even find them quite potent. So I still think they rank C, but I'm going to place them the lowest of any of the Bards. And that's the Bard, and these are our current rankings. So with the Bard, we really managed to fill in more of those higher rankings, and most Bards ended up with the B slot, with Eloquence higher because of a super potent level 3 ability, and Spirits and Whispers a bit lower at C, but as we can see by the chart, strong Cs. I can make a good and effective Spirits or Whispers Bard, no problem at all. So the next video is going to be the biggest one, the Cleric, with 14 subclasses, and we're going to break D&D. So I hope you'll join me as I wade through those. Until then, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks everybody, and I'll talk to you soon.